Well, good afternoon. I am Caradina Sale with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the NYU Silver School of Social Work's McSilver Institute. And I want to welcome you today to our webinar called Firesetting and Violent Behavior Risk Assessments with Youth and Families with Doctors Victoria Tori Phillips and Michael Fetter, who are both clinical assistant professors and attending psychologists of the ACS Bellevue Mental Health Team and the Hassenfeld Children's Hospital at NYU Langone Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. We know that fire setting and violent behaviors can be challenging to assess and attend to, and we know that assessing risk is important to reduce harm or even mortality in all treatment settings. Today's training has been created to help you develop the skills you need to holistically assess current risk, as well as anticipate any emerging risk regarding both violent and fire-setting behaviors. Before we get started, I just want to orient everyone to our Zoom webinar system. This may be a repeat for those who have joined us before, but just note that you've been placed on mute to avoid any background noises. If you have any technical issues today, please reach out to our host, Vanessa, who will help you in any way that you may need. And then lastly, please submit your questions you have throughout the webinar in our chat box. Both Vanessa and I will collect them and share them with our very talented presenters at the end of the presentation. I will now pass it on to you, Doctors Phillips and Fetter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Tori and I are both really excited to be here today talking about these two topics. They're topics that we're both very passionate about, and they're also topics that we know tend to increase clinicians' blood pressure significantly whenever a case comes across your desk with one or both of these elements. So our goal for today is to give you some information, some evidence-based information to help you feel much more comfortable when a case comes across your desk, that you can both make an assessment plan and a treatment and intervention plan. All right, so for our agenda for today, we've got a jam-packed agenda. We'll start off with a little bit of background on how each of us got interested in these areas. Then we're going to talk about the ingredients of a risk assessment generally. Then we're going to talk about why destructive behaviors are particularly challenging to assess. Then we're going to get really specific about violence, and we'll talk about some myths around violence, and then we'll talk about the evidence-supported assessments, treatment, and intervention options for that. And then we'll do the exact same thing for fire setting. We'll then leave, we're hopefully going to leave like 7-8 minutes for Q&A at the end. And we're going to make sure to put in a bunch of clinical cases that we've worked with recently to help kind of bring this to life, and hopefully it may kind of act as a template for some of the cases that you may be treating in your own clinics or practices, or whichever program you're coming from. Just a little bit background about myself, outside of what's written in the registration page. So I earned my PhD in clinical psychology at St. John's University in the child track. And I was in the lab of Tamara Del Vecchio, which focused on parenting of young kids and parent-child relationships. And as you'll see, there's actually a very, very large family and parenting component in both of these areas, perhaps larger than you may even expect. And so that's part of what gets me really interested in this area. I then did my internship at the NYU Bellevue Clinical Psychology Internship Program and stayed at NYU Child Study Center for a postdoc in ADHD in early childhood, because again, I really like those externalizing risky behaviors and how to assess them and treat them really early on. Tori.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tori Phillips. Just to give a little bit background beyond what's in the wonderful blurb for our registration. After training in University of Virginia in Charlottesville, I did a postdoc in forensic assessment and at Hackensack Meridian Hospital out in Hackensack, New Jersey, where I was really intrigued by it, mostly because I was doing evaluations of young kids who had typically been affected by abuse and maltreatment. But as part of the work there, we also started doing violence risk and risk assessments for problematic sexual behaviors. And what I found there, and has really carried through to the rest of my career, is that these labels get very quickly and sometimes very inappropriately applied to kids. and adolescents. And as a result, a lot of treatment options are limited for them moving forward. So thus began my passion for really getting a better sense of how to accurately assess and then communicate to others what risks are for youth who might be showing some behaviors that frankly can be a little bit scary. So, you know, through my work there, after my work there, I came to NYU, worked at Horizon Juvenile Detention Center with the wonderful mental health team there, and now I'm working at the ACS Children's Center with Michael, doing work with another wonderful team there.
All right, so you'll see we like to debunk lots of myths in this talk. So our first ones are going to be about some just general externalizing destructive behaviors. And the first myth is that they exist as a dichotomy. So you may hear folks say things like, "Oh, little Jimmy, he's aggressive, he's angry, he's violent, he's just a bad egg, he's always like that." Or, "Oh, little Tommy, oh, he's such a sweet kid, he has such a good heart, he could never hurt a fly, he doesn't have it in him." And the reality is the likelihood of acting on any urge to be violent or aggressive or set fires, it really exists on a spectrum. And I like to highlight that with the visible light spectrum, not just because it looks really nice and is a nice visualization, but also because light has that really cool feature, kind of like on the cover of the Dark Side of the Moon album, where if you run white light through a prism, it'll break down into its individual colors and you see that whole rainbow. And for these assessments, it's really about understanding how that overall risk breaks down into individual risk factors. And those are the factors that we have evidence-based techniques to intervene. And by making a really robust treatment in each of those areas, that's how you get your setup for success. All right, next slide. Some other myths to talk about. I really like to highlight the Bronfenbrenner ecological model here, which, just as a quick review, highlights that any child or any person exists at a center, but then there are increasingly large systems around them. So you might have a kid, and closest to them, you've got their parent, their close friends, their teacher that they see every day. And then at the next level up, you've got the school principal, someone they maybe see sometimes, but still has a big impact on their education. And then the next level up, you've got the school superintendent that this kid never sees or rarely ever sees, but still has a large impact on their education. And again, this is to really highlight that there are all these different levels, and a good assessment and a good intervention will look at all these different levels and make these interventions on the different levels. So yes, there are effective treatments. It just requires you to really kind of think broadly and not just think about sort of risk as this large blob that's hard to understand.
And as we go into our discussion about general risk assessments and really for the rest of the talk, I hope that everyone can think about the own myths that they might be carrying around with them about not only these assessments, but also the kids that might need these assessments. Because part of the work that we do, and a really important part of it, is confronting our own biases and making sure that we're open to different explanations. So the first part, before we get into the nitty gritty of violence risk and fire risk assessments, we want to talk about generally what is a risk assessment, because it is distinct from threat assessment. So it's not just a board game, although very good board game, I highly recommend. I am not a paid spokesperson, but could be for, I believe it's Hasbro. But a risk assessment is different than a threat assessment in that a threat assessment typically involves an imminent threat, an imminent event that is going to happen, usually that will cause harm or fear in someone. A risk assessment is a bit of a longer term approach where it's thinking about what is the probability that a specific behavior will happen in the future. And it doesn't mean that you're trying to predict exactly what that behavior will be and who it will be towards, but rather what's the probability given a certain set of circumstances that this behavior will occur, generally speaking. Whereas with a threat assessment, you're really looking at increased risk in the near term, which can likely then be modified with immediate crisis intervention. So the way I like to think about it really is that threat assessment is, if you have a pot of boiling water, it's immediately putting a lid on it so that the water doesn't overflow. Whereas a risk assessment is like, maybe you put a dial on the knob on your oven so that you never go above a certain, you learn that you never can go above a certain temperature, or else that pot will overflow. So it's really about the timing for a risk versus threat assessment. So this is again for all risk assessments, whether it's for fire setting, violence, problematic sexual behavior. There are multiple factors to consider, and they typically fall into one of two categories. The first being static factors. So static factors are historical or demographic factors that do not change. So for example, prior offenses, if you're doing a risk assessment, prior history of fire setting, if you're doing fire setting evaluations, or victim characteristics. Or these static factors can also be things that might change over time, but predictably. For example, age. So that's not something you can change about yourself. You can't change your birthday, although your age will change as time goes on, such as life, no matter how we try to stop it. Static factors are largely unchangeable or changeable with a certain amount of predictability over a long stretch of time. Dynamic factors, which are unlike static factors, they are defined by their ability to change throughout the life course. So this can be things like employment status, drug use, peer groups, marital status. These factors can and will likely change over the course of one's lifetime. What's interesting is that with dynamic factors, there are two subsets really, and researchers and psychologists have argued about different types of groups, but really kind of the main groups that come about are based on different paces of change. So there are dynamic factors that are considered stable dynamic risk factors, which change slowly over time, like personality. People's personalities may change over time. It's not something you're going to hopefully see overnight unless there's an organic reason. And then there's also acute dynamic risk factors, which can change day to day. For example, drug use. Someone might be a smoker one day and then they're not a smoker the next day. So these are all those factors change. Dynamic factors do change. They can be categorized into subsets based on the pace of change. So when do we do risk assessments? Well, and this is a question that we often ask ourselves in our work at the Children's Center, where we are working with youth who come into foster care, and we're wondering, is it helpful or is it necessary at this point in time to assess this child for a certain level of risk? And in the way that we kind of think about it is that there are three scenarios really where things happen that might warrant a risk assessment. First is exogenous events. This is one of my father's favorite words, so I try to find a way to put it into every presentation. But exogenous events often are one-off, or not one-off, but events that happen outside of the person. So one-off traumatic experiences, maybe natural disasters or accidents, the loss of loved ones, or abrupt change in life circumstances. I think that there's one case that I think of that really highlights this. I used to work in a juvenile detention center, and one of the young men there was known for being quite reserved, and he was a larger young man, but people use the word gentle giant to describe him. Unfortunately, while he was incarcerated, while he was detained, his father passed away quite suddenly. I was the one to unfortunately have to share this news with him, and we were in a small room, and he immediately then punched the wall behind my head. came close by, but didn't mess up my hair or anything, so we were good. However, this exogenous event really shifted how I saw this youth's risk, right? He did not have a violent history. There was no static risk factors that would have made me take pause of being in a room with him alone, or a smaller room. I wasn't alone. But an exogenous event very quickly changed his presentation And he did also then become a little bit more irritable on the hall with the other youth. So it just goes to show that and with that irritability came sometimes a tendency to act out physically his impulses. And we could sit here and argue all day why that he had shifted from being nonviolent to violent based on his life circumstances and the environment that he was in. But just an example of how exogenous events really can have a very marked difference on marked impact on people. The other factors that contribute to, okay, maybe there should be a risk assessment done, is endogenous events. So changes in things that are happening within the person. Are there changes, shifts in mood, shifts in behavior? Obviously, with the young man who punched the wall, something has changed with him. That's behavior that we had not noticed before. And there can be overlap in these exogenous and endogenous events, but we just want to make sure that we're looking at all of them. This can also be one of the things that I really like to point out, especially with younger kids, is sometimes, I think we're all aware of black box warnings on medications for increased suicidality for youth who are on a new psychiatric medication. However, I have seen in younger kids, when you change medications, if they're having an adverse reaction, one of the unexpected side effects can be heightened irritability, heightened impulse control problems, and then as a result, heightened aggressive incidents, because they're getting into situations which can, because of their impulse control problems or because they're having heightened irritability, that then lead to aggression. And sometimes as clinicians, we overlook that as a sign of, hey, this might be a reaction to a new medication, because it's not the stereotype or the warning that we're used to looking out for, say in teenagers, which is heightened suicidality. And then finally, one of the reasons that we might look into risk assessments are concerns from others. And I put concern in quotes, basically because this often equates in my mind to liability. So individuals are concerned about liability, whether this might be a potential placement, it might be educational settings, it might be treatment settings, and with good reason. So these behaviors, like I said at the beginning, can be very scary. So we want to make sure that we are making sure everyone who is going to interact with this individual is aware of the risks. But one of the things that we really try to highlight, especially for youth who we believe might sometimes be mislabeled, is that context really matters. And that's where these risk assessments can really come in handy and be very powerful. Is, if you have a youth who's been a teenager who's been very aggressive in the home towards a potentially abusive parent, and then they come into a congregate care setting, we see a shift in their behaviors, it's important to do a risk assessment, because we can then show, listen, this youth with structured environment, with consistent childcare, with known behavior, rewards and consequences for his behavior, his risk has significantly decreased. So these risk assessments not only can communicate to people what potential harm might come, but it can also communicate changes in risk level and changes in an individual's presentation, which is equally as important. So since the 1980s, there's been advances in both research and practice on how we assess risk. A lot of these advances have been mostly done with adult psychiatric patients and criminal offenders, and now it's starting to trickle down into youth. There was a conceptual shift, like Michael was saying in the myths, when we were talking about myths before, from this kind of dichotomous prediction model of a violent, especially for violence, a violence prediction model, to a more clinically relevant risk assessment. So it's not just communicating to people a label, but it's also saying, here's our assessment of the person as a whole, and let us incorporate a management and intervention technique here to help minimize risk. So we've gone from predicting violence related to a binary, the binary dangerous versus not, in which degrees of dangerous versus not were really seen as fairly static, right, and not able to change, to a more assessment-based approach rather than a prediction-based approach, where risk is contextual, dynamic, and on a continuum. So this has led to a different sort of approach, which is known as the risk need responsivity model. So any risk assessment that you're doing should really incorporate these three areas, where you're looking at the referral question, what's the risk? and a risk assessment tool is needed. It can't just be, it should not be used, just have clinical judgment. And that's something we'll talk about in a minute. Then what are the needs? What are underlying factors that put this youth at risk or put this individual at risk? And are these factors static or dynamic? Finally, responsivity, to be successful, there needs to be an intervention. And how can we intervene successfully? It has to be tailored to the individual. And then what's come about in the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years, which I think is a positive move in the field, is that we are all now looking at also protective factors. So really addressing the fact that we as clinicians have the experience, but individuals also have their own life experiences that might be helpful to their situation. So this is really moving to more of a strength-based approach to the formulation. So in keeping with this risk need responsivity model, I think it's important to really know the history of risk assessments as a whole. Again, this is for violence and for fire and for problematic sexual behaviors and sexual offending for adults. When we first, as a field of psychology, were assessing risk, it really came down to clinical judgment. And this refers to any sort of assessment where a decision is made by any means other than just statistical or mechanistic combination of variables. So the way I like to think about this is, if I'm doing a full psychological evaluation of someone, am I doing an interview and giving some measures? That would be a combination of clinical judgment. If I was not using my clinical judgment, I would just give them a standardized questionnaire for them to fill out, type in the numbers into the computer, and let it spit out a intervention plan, whether it's like the BASC or other sort of standardized questionnaires. There's no clinical judgment really used there. So that was typically how risk assessments were done. And then starting later in the 1900s, individuals like, wait, why are we leaving this up to clinical judgment? These are really serious, really scary behaviors. We need to have more of a science-backed approach to this. So thus came in the actuarial assessments, which are purely mechanistic combination of variables, preferably requiring little to no clinical judgment to score or rate those variables. So it really lends itself to those static factors, right? What's your age? What's your income level? Things like that, to give a statistically derived estimate of the likelihood of an outcome. And so what I always think of this is, it's perfect for insurance adjusters, right? That's who I think of when I think of actuarial assessments. But yet, this is where the field was 20, 30, 40 years ago. We were really focusing on actuarial assessments to assess risk because it is so scary. And again, nobody wants to take on the liability of that. And then in the mid-90s, there started to be research of like, listen, we're trained as clinicians, what are we doing? And Mossman in 1994 did a meta-analysis of 58 studies on violence prediction. And Mossman and Associates found that actuarial assessments were slightly better than human judgment in long-term assessment of risk so long-term, more than a year. But they found that the average accuracy of the actuarial assessments for shorter periods of time, so less than a year, was comparable to clinical predictions. So at least in the short term, which is many times when this risk assessments, individuals are looking for near future rather than imminent, like the threat assessments, but near future behaviors, there was not a lot of difference between the actuarial and clinical judgments. So this then led to a new generation of assessments, which is in forensic psychology referred to as SPJs, or structured professional judgments. So I'm really happy that the field has moved this way, because I really do think it is a perfect marriage between using your clinical judgment and evidence-based questions and factors. So it's an analytical method per the APA. It's an analytical method used to understand and mitigate risk factors that is discretionary in essence, but relies on evidence-based guidelines to systemize the exercise of discretion. So I think that's really the takeaway point for SPJs is, yes, it's a clinical, there's clinical judgment involved. However, it's systemized as much as it can be within this field. and that risk area. But risk assessments are scary. Yes, we know risk assessments are scary, and there's many reasons for this. Liability, none of us want to get sued. We pay enough in malpractice insurance already. We don't want to be paying more. Court is also very scary. Judges can be scary, can be nice, but can be scary. And frankly, a lot of our graduate school programs didn't prepare us to be witnesses, whether it's expert or fact witnesses in court. The unfortunate nature of kind of our legal system and our adversarial legal system at times, though, is that even if you are not a forensic psychologist, forensic therapist, or someone working in a forensic field, you can still be called to court. And so I think that's why a lot of us are nervous about getting into these kind of areas, because even though we might not have the training, we could still be subpoenaed. So you don't get training to be subpoenaed, basically. And then finally, these are very alarming behaviors. We're talking about things that are scary: murder, violence, setting fires that have really significant impacts, and can be very expensive and dangerous. So it's important that you know that these behaviors are scary, but you have the training to address this, probably better than most people. So who can do these assessments? Guess what? We can. As a field, we, as a group of individuals, can do these assessments, but with the caveat that certain things need to occur for that to happen. First of all, training. So yes, Michael and I are here today talking to you about risk assessments, particularly violence and fire setting. This is no way is going to be sufficient to then send you out into the world to do violence and risk fire setting assessments. If anything, we hope that, one, it makes you an informed consumer of reports when you read these reports, to say this is a good report, actually this one isn't a good report, what needs to be added or maybe subtracted for them to be accurate assessments. And two, hopefully to pique your interest to want to work with people like me and Michael, but also get trained and do this in your own practice, because as Michael will discuss, I think when we do fire setting, there really is a dearth of clinicians in the area, New York State, who do these assessments, and it's really, really needed to help clarify misdiagnoses and mislabeling of youth. So the components of how you can do this is, one, get the training; two, get supervision, ongoing, informal and formal. Also, know your no-go areas. So for me, I can do violence risk assessment, not all day, but fairly consistently. I love fire. I'm not setting any fires, but I love talking about it with kids and seeing if they like setting it a little too much, right? Also, I can do problematic sexual behavior risk assessments. That's something that I feel comfortable with. I cannot for the life of me do animal cruelty. Like, it makes me feel nauseous just talking about it. So knowing my areas of, like, this is what I do feel comfortable with, this is what I don't, based on my personal beliefs and systems, that's okay. And then finally, just like in a zombie apocalypse, there's safety in numbers, okay? So when you get into this field and try to move forward doing these assessments, it's really important to have a solid support group of professionals, whether it's your peers, whether it's former supervisors, whether it's even people outside of the field who are in other similar helping fields, who can understand kind of the intensity of this work, to provide that support. And finally, safety in numbers also refers to not just the number of people around you, but also the number of work, the type of work you do, to keep your work varied, right? So this is not something that I know many people can do all the time, all day, every day. I think it's important not to do it all day, every day, for a couple of reasons. The main, which is, one, burnout. It takes a lot to get trained and feel comfortable in this, and we need clinicians in the field and staying in the field. And then two, when this is all that you do, so if I were only to do fire setting risk assessments all the time, everyone's going to start to look like a fire setter to me, which isn't the case, thank goodness, but it's important to keep perspective. So I hope, you'll join us in this field. So on to, now we'll talk specifically about violence risk assessments. So what are some myths? We like to start with our myths. Some myths surrounding violent behaviors. So one, violent behavior is always volitional and goal directed. So violence can be reactive or proactive, right? And the proactive form of violence is oftentimes a little bit scarier because, again, it takes thought prior to. That can be intent. But violence isn't always proactive. When it's reactive, it's also not always volitional. It can be a trauma reaction. It can be a result of other factors, mental illness, stress, what have you. In one study done by Donahue and colleagues, when they reviewed individuals who had been found guilty but not criminally responsible for crimes, they found that over 10% of those individuals found not criminally responsible had a volitional impairment. And what's interesting, there's a quote from them in their study saying that, courts and society don't want to excuse behaviors from psychological disorders that have obvious impulse control components, right? Like they don't want to excuse behaviors that might be due to kleptomania, pyromania, etc. Partly because those behaviors, that impulse control component, is often characterized by illegal and dangerous acts. So we as a society are more focused on protecting, which is understandable. We want to protect from harm from those individuals with those disorders. However, if we're not looking at where these behaviors come from, we can't then intervene and ultimately really protect society if we're only reacting to those individual events. Another myth is that behavior is a result of mental illness. There are many, many reasons why individuals might act violently, especially youth. They might be victims of abuse or bullying. There might be exposure to violence and permissive attitudes around aggression in the home. Presence of firearms in the home is actually a very highly correlated to violence in youth for a variety of reasons, stressful family socioeconomic factors, and we can't forget brain damage. The third myth, violent behavior will always escalate. Starting with Moffat in the 1990s, he showed that actually the taxonomy of crime is not this upward linear trajectory. There are different ways that violent behavior can continue. But what Moffat found was that there were two really categories of, one is life course persistent and the other is adolescence limited. And this was confirmed by Jennings and Ringel when they did a meta-analysis, and they found a lot of variability in variability in percentages and even the most severe and chronic groups that these meta-analyses identified. And a lot of these groups were based on the range in percentages, and the way that they classified groups was based on demographic factors. And finally, the myth that still persists to this day is the myth of the super predator. Last but not least, the myth of the super predator really came out of the 1980s and 90s when there were this myth that criminologists were trying to explain rise in juvenile crime, and that what really popularized, without a lot of science behind it, was this idea that there was this new class of super predator youth who are these callous, unemotional youth who are going to continue to engage in very violent crimes, like rape, murder, etc., despite any sort of intervention, and that this was going to continue on. If unchecked, this would continue on for decades until we were overrun as a society by these super predators. The thing to remember about this myth of the super predator, it was based largely in stereotypes and biases, racial biases. It was debunked even by the individuals who first came out with it themselves. So, but still, unfortunately, there are vestiges of that myth in our programs and in a lot of our laws today. So before moving forward with any sort of risk assessment or violence risk assessment, it's really important to know who your audience is. Who is going to be reading, who is this assessment for? And the reason why that's important is because you need to speak to risk in a way that is digestible, but also don't want to disclose inappropriate amounts of information. Because as we know, this information, because it is emotionally charged, and this topic is emotionally charged, it can be misused. also remember your purpose. And this is something that even though we've been doing this now I've been doing this for a while, sometimes I forget my purpose, why I'm doing the assessment. I will have lawyers approach me and say, we need to know what his risk level is, right? And I will get in the room and I'm trying to figure out, okay, low, moderate, high, low, moderate, high. And it's only till, I'm sitting down to write the report, they'll be like, no, that's not the point of this assessment, you silly person. The point, Tori, is to think of an intervention plan to help mitigate his risk, this person's risk. It's not about the label. So that's one of the things that I need to constantly remind myself, because it's easy when you have people who are paying you to do these assessments or have their own agendas, whether it's getting a youth from foster care or pre-placement into foster care, or getting a youth moved out of their school system because of scary and dangerous behaviors. Trying to keep that noise out is very, very important. And it's important to remember that as informed consumers who read these reports, you need to be on the lookout for that, right? So if you see a risk assessment that has just basically a risk label of low, moderate, high, but has no discussion of protective factors, no discussion of interventions moving forward, that's a red flag. Additionally, if they're only speaking to that and not saying, if they're speaking beyond the scope of the assessment, so talking about, yes, this moderate risk, and they should be, waived up to adult court, or they shouldn't be waived up to adult court, or they should be placed in a residential treatment center, or what have you, that's again beyond the scope of the assessment and it is frankly inappropriate. So those are things to remember when you're consuming and reading these reports. In general, things to consider when going through a violence risk assessment. There are a lot of different factors, like we said. We'll get into static and dynamic in a minute. But what I like to do is think about these in terms of questions, these general factors, because the answer to these questions will help me formulate an overall risk. So thinking about the nature of the crime, nature of the violence, what types of violence have occurred, how serious in terms of severity, how serious and at what level, access, what is an individual's access to weapons, what is the lethality of those weapons. We've had, oftentimes in juvenile detention, we would have youth make their own weapons for protection. And while that is a violation of the facility's code and can be a crime in itself, I'm not too worried about a fork that can break between my two fingers if there's like a tine used for self-harm or potentially for protection, right? But I am going to be worried about other materials that might have been smuggled in, like a blade, a box cutter, things like that. So it's not just about access to a weapon, it's also the lethality of that weapon. Who are the targets of potential violence? Family, friend, employer, or strangers? And that speaks a lot to not only the intent, but also the level of maybe distress that the individual is in, right? So if someone really has indiscriminate rage towards anyone walking down the street, that's going to be riskier than if there's a specific target, especially if that target is someone who is not reachable, whether it's a celebrity or a politician or what have you. And then imminence, how soon is this violent behavior going to happen? Frequency, how often is the person wanting to engage in it? What context does the risk increase and decrease? So looking at both sides of that coin. And then finally, what's the probability that all of these things, the perfect storm would come together for the violence to actually occur? So those are just questions that I ask myself going into any sort of risk assessment, but especially for violence, because access and targets and weapons are really important and very real factors that are tangible. So when we think then to our static and dynamic risk factors, static factors that I look at are history of violence. And this can be broken down into a lot of other things that were kind of seen in that general risk factor category slide that we just had. Nature of the violence, who were the targets, did the targets change? Did it go from being someone known to someone more general? The age of first violent event, but also the trajectory. Were there different violent events at different times? What are the adverse childhood experiences? And within that, what are the types of the experiences and who are the perpetrators? because known versus unknown adults or known versus unknown even peers can have varying different impacts. Finally, family history, or the last two are family oriented and family history of violence. And this includes, but is not limited to, history of arrests, right? History of incarceration, but it doesn't have to include just arrests or incarceration. And then family discipline. What are attitudes in the home around violence? What's punitive? Is it punitive discipline? You know, and one of the things that I always think of, this one case that I had where it was a 12-year-old who everyone said, oh, you need to watch out because he stabbed his sister. And I said, okay. And so we were doing an assessment of him, but it come to find out he stabbed his sister when he was 6 years old. And the family response to that was very strongly negative, appropriately so. And so, yes, while this youth had engaged in this really violent act, which I think, you know, he had been very involved with video games, the family really adjusted their approach to TV and video games after the incident. But if you were to look at this 12-year-old now 6 years after that event and look at him just based on static risk factors, he would seem very risky, right? Very young at his first age of offense. He used a weapon that caused serious bodily harm. He didn't really have a history of adverse childhood experiences, so that was concerning that it kind of came out of nowhere. However, the family discipline and the family reaction, the family attitudes towards violence were so strong that they really changed the picture of what he looked like after that. Other things to consider then are dynamic factors. These are the factors that change over time, either quickly or a little bit less quickly. Peer relationships, which can be positive or negative. So again, for all of these things, we're not just looking at them as potential risk factors. Are any of these areas also potential areas for protective factors or helping to mitigate risk? So peer relationships, social support, mental illness, impulse control, anger, substance use, and then again, attitudes towards both interventions and violence. So these are all risk factors which should be of no surprise, because they're risk factors, frankly, that we look at for other behaviors as well. So it's important just to remember that we do know how to assess for risk in other areas, and that there's a lot of overlap between the different areas. So some specific violence assessment tools that you may see as a consumer of these reports, and that you should look out for, frankly, because I think they're fairly good and have good research behind them. The first is, and these are specific to youth and juveniles. The first would be the SAVRI, which stands for Structured Assessment of Violence Risk in Youth. And as you can see, it's split into 3 domains. The historical risk factors really speak to those static factors that we were talking about, social contextual risk factors, and individual clinical factors. And what I like about the SAVRI is that it also includes protective factors that are rated as either present or absent and can be used in the formulation. The summary score, and then there's a final overall summary score of low, moderate, or high risk. Clinicians also have the ability to say, you know, maybe it's low, moderate, or moderate, high, so that you can do gradations within that. And that's okay if you do see that. That's not going beyond the scope of the SAVRI. Don't have to yell at the evaluator for that one. Another structured professional judgment tool that is used in risk assessment is something called the START-AV, or Short-Term Assessment of Risk and Treatability, the adolescent version. It looks at multiple adverse outcomes, including risk of violence towards others, suicide, self-harm, victimization, substance abuse, unauthorized leave, or also kind of running away behaviors, or something we like to call the Children's Center AWOC, self-neglect, and general offending. After completing item ratings, evaluators also consider the youth's history, and then using all the available information, make a structured professional judgment as to the final risk estimates for short-term adverse events. And you will see START used in a lot of court diversion programs and court treatment programs. It's a fairly comprehensive measure, and it's used for youth 12 to 18. So if you see that on a report, check of approval. And then finally, this one's a little bit more specific to youth who are court involved. I've seen it mostly used with youth who are being assessed for risk and might have their cases waived up to adult court. And this is called the Risk Sophistication Treatment and Amenability Inventory, RSTI, which unsurprisingly has 3 factors, which all fall within the title of the measure itself. What's interesting about this measure is that it doesn't give you an overall risk assessment level for the whole shebang, but it does give you T-scale scores for each factor or each scale. So you can speak separately to risk for dangerousness, sophistication, maturity, and then treatment amenability. So as we wrap up here, I do want to say that while these behaviors are very scary, we do have tools that we can use to help reduce violent behaviors. And the first and kind of like the least flashy of all of them is intervention. Is prevention. So all of the preventative behaviors that we know or preventative factors, that impacts protective factors in other areas is also very important in this area. So having family interventions is helpful. There are some mixed results in terms of individualized treatments. So mixed evidence for CBT alone. Some have shown that CBT can be more effective than punishment, and punishment being like jail time or what have you, incarceration. And that reduces risk of recidivism, but that's usually in the short term. Actually, MST, multisystemic therapy, has been shown over the long term to be even more effective for reducing recidivism, especially for extremely violent youth. Asher and colleagues have a really interesting article from 2018, which showed that the impact of MST over violent acts, it was positive both for extremely violent and non-extremely violent youth offenders. However, it was not a linear trajectory for the extremely violent offenders. There was some deterioration in behavior, and then after kind of this, reaction to the intervention, negative reaction to the intervention, the youth involved started to buy in and see the positive effects. So it was really great. What's also really helpful are group interventions. And there's a really interesting meta-analysis done by Fazal and colleagues that recently came out that actually they looked at, I believe it was 16 meta-analyses, 9 of which were clinical interventions and 5 of which were legislative actions. And they actually found, and this was a smaller sample size, but they found that group-based initiatives, including sports-based initiatives, had some of the most positive impact on recidivism. And there's also credible messenger programs. So when you think of mentoring programs or individuals who've had lived experiences and can come back to their communities and provide guidance, that really has some of the most impact. And then something not to kind of sleep on is this idea of community mobilization, which is that the community really has to have buy-in to these interventions, whether it's group or individual, in order for it to have a positive impact. So with that, I will end our discussion about violence, and we'll talk about my second favorite topic, which is fire setting. So I'm handing it over to you, Michael.
Excellent, thank you. All right, and here we go. All right, so before we get into some of the nuances of fire setting assessment, I want to just start with some definitions. The general umbrella category we're going to talk about is youth fire misuse or fire setting, and there are a lot of different individual behavior examples that fall under that larger umbrella category. And as with everything else, there's a whole spectrum of these behaviors, ranging from experimenting with matches, which is actually really common for kids to experiment with lighting some paper or toilet tissue with matches, or playing with a lighter. Maybe they find mom or dad's lighter lying around and they're flicking it on and off. And it moves up towards things like igniting accelerants or aerosols. You can think about all the cans of Axe body spray that have been set on fire in locker rooms, high school locker rooms across the country. Setting off fireworks. social media fire challenges are actually becoming much more, they're really concerning and they're becoming much more common, and kids end up with some pretty bad burns and injuries from these fire challenges. And as we're moving up here, there's also the term malicious false alarm, which refers to when someone pulls a fire alarm when they know there's no fire. And that's actually in New York City, that's actually a criminal act and is actually something we're going to come back to as a predictor for future fire setting behavior. And we'll talk about why shortly. And speaking of legal terms, arson is a legal term that refers to the intentional use of fire to cause destruction or harm. And as another not so fun fact, there are 5 levels of arson charges in New York City, and every single one of them is actually a felony. So this is taken really, really seriously by New York City. And just as a quick historical background, this comes out of the 1960s and 70s, where there was an immense amount of arson, people burning down buildings and cars, where the phrase the Bronx is burning came from. And because of this, there was a lot of legislature passed around arson to make it a really serious crime. This is not just something that's physically dangerous, but also criminally can be really, really life-changing for kids. All right, so as usual, we'll go through some myths about the fire setting behaviors. The first one has to do with the size of a fire. So if Timmy sets a little fire in his basement a few times, maybe leaves a little burn mark, sometimes people have a tendency to say, oh, okay, not a big deal. There was no real damage. He was being safe. He's just a kid being a kid. Versus if Timmy accidentally set a whole room on fire, they say, oh my God, this kid is so dangerous. He's a fire setter. He's a arsonist. He's a firebug. There's, oh my God, what are we going to do? And the reality is that fire science is actually quite complicated, and there are a lot of factors that will determine whether lighting a match in one room will cause no significant damage versus setting the whole room ablaze in less than a minute. So just looking at the size of a fire is not a useful predictor, but we'll talk about what are useful predictors in a minute. Another important term to talk about is pyromania, which is a DSM diagnosis, so it's in the DSM. However, it has very specific criteria where you have to have some sort of physiological arousal or tension that is then reduced after you set a fire. The issue with that is we actually find very few, if any, kids that actually meet that technical definition. And we'll talk about a lot of the other motivators that we do see very commonly. But the problem is that if you can't diagnose it, you can't really get good data on it. You can't really bill for it effectively. It's hard to advocate for legislature around this area. So that's my first step on the soapbox for a moment of in this area and things that are worth looking into changing. Also, just as a quick little historical note again, because I love these historical notes, Freud, the original thought around fire setting was that that males wanted to set fires so they could urinate on the fires. This also turned into a connection between bedwetting and fire setting behavior. There's no evidence there. There's no data. We're not going to spend any time on it because there's just no evidence for it. Next important myth is that there's no treatment for this. There's no way to stop kids from setting fires. The reality is there are a lot of effective treatments. Some of them are actually quite simple, and you may already be using a lot of those principles, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Okay, so now that you know how not to think about fire and what not to focus on, what should you be thinking about when it comes to fire setting behaviors? I would actually encourage you to use the same type of spectrum of the desire for a kid to ride a bike without a helmet. And feel free to put in the chat if you ever, as a kid, ever had the thought of riding a bike without a helmet. Maybe because your friends were going to make fun of you, it was ugly, it was bulky, it messed up your hair, you just forgot it and you were running late, or maybe even this is something big in New York City, is that maybe your parents model not wearing a helmet because we have a city bike program here where you're not legally required to wear a helmet as an adult. So very few people do. So why would your kids wear a helmet if they don't see you wearing it? And I'm seeing lots of yeses in the chat. And That's great. Well, maybe not great, but that's good to know. And if anyone said that you never, ever, ever had the thought of riding a bike without a helmet, I would say liar, liar, pants on fire to stick with our fire topic. But the idea here is the same thing with fire. The curiosity and the desire to play with it as a kid is actually normative. And there is a level of normal interest. You can think about all the cool factors of seeing like a campfire or a fire in a fireplace. So there is a normative level of it. That doesn't mean we say, oh, great, kids, go play with fire. We actually want to be very strict around this and say, no, we're going to have strong values. Fire is a tool and it's not a toy. We have to be safe around it, etc. But there is that level where it goes from normative to really, really problematic. And that's the key of what we're going to talk about here. How do you figure out that difference? So the next question you might have is, well, if this urge to play with fire is so common, why don't I hear more about it? And the answer is you actually probably do, just don't realize it. A lot of times, like if a fire is in the news or online, right after it happened, the cause of the fire has not yet been determined. The investigation still needs to be done by the fire marshals. And by the time it's determined that a child set the fire, the story is long out of the news cycle and no one's talking about it. The other piece is that kids are actually fairly good at hiding this. And if you don't ask about it, it just doesn't come out. And I'll just give a quick story here. Last week I was in a store where I shop pretty frequently, and a lot of the cashiers are like high school, college age kids. And they asked me, what I do. And they said, hey, doctor, you got any cool stuff coming up at work this week? And I said, yes, I'm giving this talk on fire setting behaviors and kids. And they said, oh, what? You mean kids set fires? You mean like they're burning stuff? I'm like, yeah, it's pretty scary. It actually happens more than you think. And they were quiet for about half a second. And then one of them says, yeah, when I used to babysit my cousin, we used to put the pot on the stove, turn it on, and just stick stuff in there and see what would happen, what would melt, what would burn. And I said, that's not so great. And it doesn't sound like you're doing it anymore. And then the next cashier over says, oh yeah, it's fun, like playing with lighters, just seeing what'll melt or burn. It's kind of fun. And I was like, oh my God, guys, you got to stop doing this. This is not safe. But these are, kids balancing school and a job, and they're responsible for handling money, and they're still playing with fire. So it's just something to think about. And in terms of the estimate of the data that we do have, which again is not great and is probably an underestimate, but it ranges somewhere from 30 to 70,000 fires a year just in the US set by kids. And I think based on Tori and my experience, it's probably on the higher end of that. We have been shocked by the number of times kids have even set fires in schools or in government buildings. And as long as it didn't set off the smoke alarm and some adult or staff member was able to put out the fire, it never got reported. And this happens a lot more than you may realize. We'll talk about some case examples. So it's probably worth actually asking a lot of your patients about it. And then don't worry, we'll give you some techniques here on what to do about it when they say, yes, I do play with fire. And just looking at, this is awful, just the number of deaths and injuries. $235 million in estimated property damage. If we just took that money one year and put it towards treating this problem, we'd actually probably be a lot better off and actually solve a lot of this issue. Same with just the number of arrests and the legal consequences that can be lifetime for kids coming from setting fires. Okay, so now the question is, well, how do I know if a kid's behavior is ranging from that normative range to really higher risk? What do I do? How do I figure this out? So I'm going to start with talking about the best, most comprehensive assessment system out there, which is the Fire Setting Risk Assessment Tool for Youth, created by the illustrious Dr. Rob, who trained myself and Tori. And oops, let me go back there. And there we go. And who actually is, as you'll see at the end of the slide, is actually going to be giving training in person on the Frat Y through CTAC over the next few weeks and months. One set in New York City, one set in Albany. So we'll have some of the details at the end. And we really encourage folks to take this training and sign up for it because this is a really great system. And as Dr. Rob likes to say, this system combines the art and science of assessment. And what that means is that there's a lot of science here. We have 5 risk factor domains that you go through and pretty systematically assess. but the art really comes in knowing how to ask these questions, who to ask it to, and really crucially, which questions to ask multiple people to get multiple perspectives, because this is an area can have a lot of shame for kids, a lot of embarrassments, consequences. It may be things no one's even thought to ask about before, and suddenly parents are overwhelmed hearing about their kids setting a fire. So there's a lot to it, and a lot of knowing how to get the data that you need. So let's start with actually the bottom of the 5 factors, the fire setting behavior. So this looks at the number of fires a child has set, the span of time over which they've been setting it. Has it increased in the level of complexity of the incendiary device and the material they're using, the fuel? So are they just lighting matches and paper? Are they using aerosols? Are they trying to build bombs, which, believe it or not, is something we've heard kids talk about in some of our assessments. It's looking at their interest in fire. Is this something that they talk about constantly? Do they have a restricted interest in the fire department and fire activity? Do they have history of pulling false alarms? All of that information. Then the other 4 factors may be already more familiar from things that you're doing for other assessments, psychoed testing, neuropsych testing, or just any comprehensive intake evaluation. You're looking at parent-family functioning, what type of discipline techniques are used, history of parent mental health, mental illness, more fire specific, do parents smoke in the home? What are the values around fire safety in the home? Are there these parents who are keeping smoke alarms working and fire extinguishers and making escape plans with their kids? Things like that. You've got behavioral functioning. So is this a kid who is showing signs of impulsivity and ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder? Where on that spectrum are they falling? You've got social and emotional functioning. So is this kid showing symptoms of anxiety, depression, other mental illnesses? Are they being bullied at school? Are they bullying other kids at school? Are they able to maintain friendships? Are they able to use emotion regulation strategies to really get that sense of how the kid is functioning socially and emotionally? Then we've got school cognitive functioning. So is this a kid with a really low IQ? We'll talk in a few minutes about cases Tori and I have seen of kids who were just completely missed that they had really, really low IQs, and people thought they just had no empathy when they were setting fires, and really they just didn't understand the consequence or even the abstract concept of injury to others or breaking rules, things like that. Or does this kid perhaps need an IEP and they haven't been getting it and they're really angry? So there are a lot of these different areas, and you want to assess for all of them. And then after you've assessed for it, you can come up with an overall risk category. But the really important key here is that that risk level and that risk category is based on the assumption that you will be putting into place all the recommendations in the report from the recommendations section. And we're going to talk about what some of those look like, because the key is we don't want to just suggest that there's this unchangeable risk level, but actually a lot of these factors can be improved. And so what risk is left over after you've already minimized these variables? All right. Okay. So now you may be wondering, well, how do we collect all this data? Are there measures out there that can be used? And the answer is yes, there are some really good ones. I'm going to start with the fire setting specific ones because they may be ones you're not super familiar with. There's the FRI, fire setting risk interview. That is actually given to parents, guardians, clinicians, teachers, guidance counselors, anyone that knows this child and is assessing for not just the child history of fire setting behaviors, but also, especially for the parents, are assessing things like what are the discipline techniques used in the home? Is there a culture of fire safety in the home? So it's more comprehensive than just asking about what fires has the kid set and how. But it's also asking things like, does the kid talk about fire a lot? Do they show a lot of interest in it? All the things we were talking about that help you gather the data for those 5 factors. There's also the CFI, the Children's Fire Setting Interview, which is what you administer directly to the child. It's relatively long, but it can actually be adapted to a child's developmental level and age. And it similarly asks about a child's history of fire setting and their interest in fire, but it also has things like a little quiz on the flammability of different materials to get a sense of the child's knowledge of flammability. It has kids doing these role plays of what do you do if you're in a room and there's a fire right outside the room? How do you get help? How do you call 911? So it's pretty comprehensive to give you to not just get stuck on that view of, well, did this kid set a fire or not, for example. The fire setting assessment schedule looks at a child or adult's attitudes towards fire and their thoughts and feelings that have preceded it or resulted from setting the fire to again give you really good data. For the other factors, these other measures are things you may be already very familiar with from work that you typically do with kids. You have your parenting measures, your APQ. There's a great one I like that's called the six pack, not just because it has a great name, but also gives some helpful data, parenting stress inventory, things like that. Then you've got your social, emotional, and behavioral measures, so things like your BASCs, your Beck inventory, CDIs, your Connors scales, all of those great measures. You've got your IQ tests, your Wechsler test, your Woodcock-Johnson's, IQ and achievement tests, which if you're especially suspecting a kid has some intellectual disability, it's really important to get that testing done if they haven't had it yet. We know it can be hard to get testing done, but it is really important. And finally, really want to emphasize the importance of trauma measures and resiliency measures, because as we'll talk about in a moment, a lot of fire setting behavior comes out of trauma. And it's something that can be missed in these evaluations if you don't specifically look for it. So we really want to make sure everyone's looking for it. All right, so now you've sat down, you've spoken to all the collateral sources, you've collected all your data, you've got all your measures, and you're sitting down and you say, okay, what do I do with this? How do I put this all together? How do I make a story about what's going on here? And it's similar to if you're ever putting together a biopsychosocial model where you're thinking about strengths and weaknesses, things like that. So I've put a number of different categories here that tend to be typical motivating categories for fire setting. And I purposely made them into little blocks because I want to emphasize that it's like a Lego or building blocks where they really stack on each other, because it's very rare that a kid just has one of these blocks. It's usually a combination and an interplay between two or more of these blocks. So going through the first one here, the cry for help, the lost sadness, the anger block, that I really like to think of it as that back brain or the amygdala block that may be reacting to some trauma or some stressor that has really disrupted this kid's life, and they're trying to get help. They're trying to get make a sign that they need help. I'm thinking in this one about adolescent girl that Tori and I saw recently who was constantly having big fights with her mom, and they'd be really explosive, poor emotion regulation management at home. And one time, for whatever reason, this kid decided, I'm so angry, I'm just going to turn the stove on, I'm going to put some paper on the stove, and it's going to make a big fire, and I'm just going to leave. And it sure got everybody's attention, and it was an effective cry for help, but not a very safe one. And that actually connects to this bottom middle block of that problem solving tool or escape mechanism tool, where sometimes fire is a way that people learn to express that need for help or to solve problems. And that's a really dangerous way of solving your problems. But kids can learn that this is a way that I can solve these problems. Another block here is the curiosity block, which has a spectrum ranging from that simple curiosity that we might think of as that age normative, typical curiosity of playing with fire, but it moves up to that complex curiosity where you might think more about kids who have autism spectrum disorder, restricted interests in fire. There was a kid we assessed, a teen male who uh, almost saw himself as like a mad scientist who could control fire and said, I can control fire. I understand how it works. Surprise, surprise, he didn't really understand how it worked. And in fact, one time he got really angry and upset and tried to set a fire on the stove, which is, again, let's come back to the stove. It's actually a pretty common place for kids that we've seen to set fires. So this, again, was a mix of that anger, cry for help, but also coming from this curiosity. Then we've got our cognitive impairment or serious mental illness block. Going back to what we were mentioning before, we've had kids where it came, like 9, 10-year-old kids who were setting fires in school because they were saying, well, if I set a fire in school, school burns down, I don't have to go to school tomorrow. And this again comes to the problem solving tool escape mechanism piece, where these kids just didn't understand that actually they could get hurt, other people could get hurt. It's not just a way to get yourself a free snow day. Another block here, the peer group affiliation, group delinquency. This is where we think about kids who are using fire together, maybe as part of criminal acts, maybe just for fun, social media challenges. And you can see how the treatment might be different for a kid that's doing this because of a peer group versus a cry for help from trauma. The last block here, the sensory seeking or sensory soothing block. Sensory seeking, I usually think of as kids on that ADHD spectrum, which adrenaline junkie, searching for that adrenaline rush, the excitement that comes from fire. Sensory soothing might be more going back to kids with ASD who find it really soothing to see the light from the fire or the smell or the sounds. This could be a place, for example, an intervention might be getting a kid one of those fake fireplaces that have the fire and like a little heater that gives off some heat. So it's a safe way to meet that sensory need. So the next question you may have is, well, this sounds great, but if I don't have that extensive training in the frat one, I haven't had the consultation, and it's hard to know to do all of that work, what can I use in the meantime? And there are these screener measures you can use that can at least, even from today, help you determine, is this case that I'm seeing at that more normative level, or is this really already concerning and I really need to get someone with that frat Y expertise in to help with this case? So there's a link here that links to the Firesetting and fire safety identification tool, which is really nice because it has a few vignettes that go along with it that can kind of you can use as a template to help determine where your case falls in these different risk levels. And the second link not only includes a link to the FFIT, it also has a lot of psychoeducational materials that you can use after you've completed the FFIT and you want to start with some intervention. And speaking of interventions, what exactly can I do to reduce fire setting behaviors? And there's the little model we have here, a little formula: fire safety education plus effective parenting plus appropriate therapy is your best bet for success. What you may not know is that there's actually a National Fire Academy under the purview of FEMA, and they actually create they do lots of training for fire service individuals, but they have a program on youth fire setter intervention specialists and a youth fire setter intervention program. And these are fantastic programs that will not just give kids basic education of like stop, drop, and roll or things that they learned in a school presentation, but it goes into some of the fire science and also really highlights the consequences of fire misuse. And it's not a scare tactic. It's not meant to just scare kids, but it does show the consequences of like videos of how quickly a room can totally be engulfed in less than 45 seconds, or some stories about, kids that have unfortunately died after running back into a fire, things like that, to start to make kids get a little bit and it should be a little bit uncomfortable to learn about this, to make them aware of the danger. But of course, that's not the only part of the treatment. We'll talk, those other two pieces are just as important, because we know education alone, especially for more complex cases, may not be sufficient to stop the fire setting behavior altogether. So now you may be thinking, okay, this sounds great. How do I find out if there's a youth fire center intervention program I can collaborate with and refer kids to? If you are in the 5 boroughs of New York, there is an FDNY fire marshal, Jim Berenger, who is fantastic and goes around all 5 boroughs with him and his partner, meeting with kids and providing this fire safety education program. And he knows he may get a flurry of referrals after this, so don't worry, we warned him ahead of time. But as we talk about with him all the time, his presentation and this fire safety is awesome, but without follow-up mental health treatment, follow-up intervention, it's not going to be enough to solve this problem. So we really want to encourage folks to collaborate with their fire safety intervention program. And actually, I did see in the chat before, I was really happy to see one of the folks who runs one of the other fire setter intervention programs in New York State is on here, which is great. If you are outside of the 5 boroughs and you need to find your local YFIP program. Give a shout out here to Bill McGovern in the New York State Office of Fire Prevention and Control. His office has compiled a list of these programs, so you can email them or call them at that number, and they will connect you with your local YFIP program. Or if there isn't one available, they will try to get you an alternate method of getting that fire safety education. If, let's say, you still can't access the YFIP program, or you want to have some other intervention tools you can use right on the spot with the patient, there are a lot of things available online. The National Fire Academy actually wants this material to be available so folks can use it. Sean's story goes through, it's a video series that goes through a child who set fires and some of the consequences. Definitely recommend you take a look at the trailer. You can click on the link and check that out after we're finished. There's also a great set of fire safety education videos that comes out of New Jersey. That's the Fire Is series, which, fun fact, is hosted by Dr. Frank Field and Stormfield, the meteorologist that folks from the New York area may be familiar with from a few years ago, which is really cool. And to also just advocate for getting some of this training through the National Fire Academy if you're able to. In terms of the effective parenting piece, in one sense, I mean this kind of broadly. So making sure a child has at least one positive, stable adult relationship, even if it's not with their parent, is really, really critical. We know from all the research that is really protective against many things, including fire setting behaviors, but a lot of risky behaviors as well. On a more concrete level, for parents or guardians, whoever is taking care of the child, it's really important that they are reducing access to means of fire setting. So lighters, matches, things are locked away. For young kids, you've got oven knob covers installed properly. Really just making that fire safety attitude in the home is really important. So checking your smoke alarms, not pulling down the smoke alarms, as we've heard about from kids where they say, oh yeah, it used to beep a lot, so grandma just took it down. And now she also dries her pants in the oven, on the stove, instead of using the dryer. And we're like, oh, that's not great. That's really not great. Making sure they're working fire extinguishers, escape plans that are practiced between the family is really, really important. And these are all pieces that are also emphasized in a fire safety education program. Supervision of parental controls, screen monitoring, not just to make sure kids are not being exposed to fire safety challenge, or fire safety, I wish they would be to fire setting challenges on social media, but also making sure they're not getting cyberbullied, they're not being sexually exploited, all the other things that can then lead to that cry for help via fire setting. And of course, parents using appropriate parenting strategies, that they're not overly punitive. And finally, parents, if they smoke, really making sure that there's a clear plan that they are mitigating the amount of access that the kid has to even seeing the parents smoke and lighting cigarettes as much as possible. And then finally, in terms of the appropriate therapy, we really want to emphasize that the evidence-based therapy treatment is actually not that specialized. It comes from cognitive behavior therapy models, parent management training, which goes to everything we just talked about in the last slide. But it's really your CBT with a bit of a fire focus. So it might be things like focusing on maladaptive thoughts related to fire, or automatic thoughts related to fire, or if your kid has really poor social skills and they use fire because they're angry about that, well, getting them into a social skills program and treating the underlying issues. That is really, really important. And it really comes from a CBT, from this underlying CBT model. There's this great book available online on Amazon through the Programs That Work series by Dr. David Kolko, who is a real pioneer in this field. And so I highly recommend folks purchase this book. And he also provides trainings as well. There's also the Katarina Fritzen, used to be part of a lab, the Australian Centre for Arson Research and Treatment, which the lab is somewhat debunked at this point, but she is available to provide treatment training as well. And some of their model is a little bit more adult focused, has a little bit of an REBT and DBT bend of being aware of the rights of everyone to live a safe life. And if you're setting fires, you're not respecting others' rights to safety, and things like that. So this is hopefully going to help folks feel a little bit more comfortable with these areas. And we've got references here, so all the slides will be posted and you'll be able to see all the references. And we've got all of the resources, all the things we talked about. We've got links here and the slides will be posted so that you'll be able to get copies of this and all of this information. And now we've got a few minutes for Q&A.
Yes, we do. Thank you so much. This was such a rich and important webinar. Everybody in the chat is very appreciative, recognizing that it's chock full of information. So many people are wondering when the slides are going to be available, and they will be available within a few days on our website with the recording. So hold tight for that. But we do have a few questions. So I wanted to start with, you did say, I heard you, so there's a question about, are there limitations, implications using these assessment tools for youth who are identified intellectually challenged? And I did hear you talk a little bit about that. Is there anything else you may want to add around that question?
Well, I think that with the risk assessments, one of the benefits of the structure, the SPJs, the structured professional judgments, is that it takes IQ into account and it's not limiting in terms of applying the factors and assessing for risk factors. So rather than having like a standardized measure that you give to an individual and then they complete, it doesn't have to be a certain, reading level or what have you. The IQ is rather one of these static factors that is taken into account when determining risk level. And that I think is honestly a good thing, because unfortunately because these behaviors are so scary and so big, and there actually is very small incidence rates in the population of these behaviors, of true fire setters, of truly violent individuals. And so the research around specific populations within these small groups is even smaller. So I guess that's my response.
Thank you. What is the difference between known and unknown perpetrators on risk levels? Any thoughts there?
I think maybe I don't understand the question as well. Known and unknown. So are we saying like legally unknown, like they've been arrested and incarcerated? I think that really is, I don't know specifically what the research shows about those risk levels, but I do know that known versus unknown to law enforcement can be increase or decrease your risk factor accordingly. So being known to legal law enforcement, oftentimes, and we have to take racial and other factors into account here, but oftentimes being known to law enforcement for any of these behaviors indicates more serious or violent or fire setting behaviors. So that can increase your risk level.
Okay, if the person that asked that question, or people, if you want to chat in any other follow-up questions, I wasn't sure exactly what it was referring to too, but it sounded really important. So I think that answer is fantastic. But if there's any other follow-up questions, please chat them in. Are there any violence risk assessments for youth who might act out sexually?
Yes, there are many assessments for sexual that include violence and sexual problematic sexual behaviors. That could be a whole nother talk, but I have the acronyms that I could share. The JSOAP, the JSORAT. These are juvenile specific measures. Typically, though, the individual has to have been detained or at least charged with an offense. Because a lot of the questions do surround that. And one of the measures that I like is actually called the Child Sexual Behavior Inventory for younger children, which you use with with a caregiver who knows the youth from when they were younger. because that also helps put those sexual behaviors into context. But there are a lot of good trainings out there on problematic sexual behaviors and the assessment of problematic sexual behaviors, just beyond the scope of today.
Thank you. Yeah, I did hear you mention that as well. Can these tools include assessments of young adults 18 to 21 years old? Are they part of the age range that you're talking about today? If not, um, are there others to recommend? Because the person who asked this question did say it's not uncommon to have youth who are aging up and due to fire setting histories are occasionally rejected by housing providers. And knowing that those labels that you did talk about, so there's a question about labels, but before we get there, are these assessments for ages 18 to 21, or do you recommend others?
So for the fire setting, I don't know, Michael, if you want to jump in if you want. The frat Y is actually the youth version of the fire setting assessment. They also have an adult version. I will say that we've talked to Dr. Stadelnick about using this with that kind of young adult in between population. And one of my more recent fire setting risk assessments was done with an 18-year-old young man who had a lower IQ, potentially on the autism spectrum. So there is some flexibility with using it, because again, in these systems, we're seeing young adults now in our foster care placements or pre-placement agencies that go well beyond the age of 18.
Okay, thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question. How can we interfere with these labels traveling with kids? Somebody did note that there's, for example, copy and pasting that's often done. How can we interfere with that?
I think especially for the fire setting side, because we see that a lot, is literally not using the terms like this child is a fire setter, but as much as possible trying to give that context and writing up things such as this child had one incident of fire setting at this age due to factors X, Y, and Z, so that you can still give the clinical information and the context without just saying this child's a fire setter. Because we've seen the same thing, and it's, we've even had kids where somehow the label got put on the kid as being a fire setter when it was actually the parent who was threatening to like burn down their caseworker's home, and somehow it got attached to the kid and had to do a whole assessment to just figure out that this kid was actually mislabeled this. So I 100% see it, and I don't know that there's a perfect solution.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, I think using our skills as clinicians that we already have, which is being curious when we see these things, right? Like, okay, fire setter, where's the documentation? And as a provider who might be writing stuff up, I try really hard to describe behaviors, not labels. So saying, this youth engaged in fire play once, rather than saying like history of fire setting. And I know that we all have lots of paperwork and are trying to get through it as quickly as possible, but just keeping that perspective is really important.
Yeah, this could be a whole other webinar, right? But it's so important. And as Jordan chatted in, person-centered language, not pathologizing language. Thank you. So can you go to the next slide? This is just thank you so much. This has been so helpful. I just wanted to, so you said stay in touch so people could stay in touch with you. And I highly recommend that if you're in need. And I did want to spend just a second talking about our upcoming event that Dr. Feder had referred to. But first we have Navigating Professional Boundaries in Clinical Care happening May 22nd from 11 to 12:30. Community and culturally based approaches to healing from trauma in refugee and immigrant communities on May 30th from 12 to 1. So please join us for those events. And if you go to the next slide, this is our coming soon offering that you will be hearing about very soon. The Fire Setting Risk Assessment Tool for Youth, Frat Y, that we talked about today, training. This is a 2-day workshop. So it's 10 to 5 every day for 2 days. We'll be in New York City on June 6th and 7th. And in Albany, June 17th and 18th, there will be an application that you will need to complete. And it's on a first come, first serve basis. So we wanted to give you all here a heads up that email will be coming to you, I believe next week or the week after. Vanessa? Do we know when everyone will be getting the email with the application? Next week, she says. Okay, thank you. So next week, keep your eye out. And that's all we have for today. Thank you all so much. It's wonderful to be with you all as usual. And Michael and Tori, you two are incredible. We're so grateful to have you share your expertise with us. So fantastic. Love the claps. Thank you.